I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're wiping down a counter, folding a tired stack of laundry, or coming home from a long shift, your feet aching and your heart heavier than usual. She vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the sound of her father's empire crumbling. 2 hours remained before the world would declare Elizabeth Sullivan dead. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. In the glittering skyline of Chicago, where glass towers pierce the winter sky like frozen prayers, the Sullivan Mansion sat on Lake Shore Drive like a marble tomb. Robert Sullivan had built his fortune from nothing: real estate investments that multiplied into billions, cryptocurrency portfolios that made headlines, and stock market decisions that moved entire sectors. His net worth stretched across multiple currencies, from dollar-denominated assets to gold reserves, but all that wealth couldn't buy back the one thing that mattered most. The morning air was sharp enough to cut glass when Maria Gonzalez stepped off the CTA bus at Oak Street Beach. Her breath formed small clouds in the January cold as she walked the final 3 blocks to the mansion, her worn shoes clicking against ice-covered sidewalks. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival required strength disguised as softness. The navy blue uniform beneath her winter coat was pressed and clean, her small act of rebellion against a world that expected her to be invisible. Maria had been riding the same route for 6 months now, ever since the employment agency matched her with the Sullivan household. The commute from her cramped apartment in Pilsen took 1 hour and 15 minutes each way, but she never complained. Work was work, and after her husband Miguel had left her with 2 children and a mountain of bills, she understood that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Each morning, she carried hope in her chest like a small flame, protected from the wind by years of quiet endurance. The mansion's limestone facade loomed before her, its Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the colorful murals and corner stores of her neighborhood. Security cameras tracked her movement as she approached the service entrance, a reminder that even here, where she spent more waking hours than in her own home, she remained an outsider. The doorman's nod was perfunctory, acknowledgement without warmth. Maria had learned to expect nothing more. Inside, the house breathed with expensive silence. Marble floors stretched beneath vaulted ceilings that seemed to swallow sound, and crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across surfaces that gleamed with meticulous care. The air carried the faint scent of white roses from the greenhouse and the antiseptic cleanliness that money could buy. But beneath the perfection, Maria sensed something else, a sadness so deep it had soaked into the very walls. Robert Sullivan's voice carried from the library, sharp with the authority that had built his empire. He was on another conference call with his investment managers, discussing portfolio diversification and market volatility, with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything else. Maria had learned to recognize the rhythm of his days, early morning calls to London and Hong Kong, followed by meetings that stretched into evening, each conversation measured in millions of dollars. His world moved at the speed of global finance, where fortunes could be made or lost in the space between heartbeats. But this morning felt different. There was an edge to his voice, a crack in the armor that years of boardroom battles had forged. Through the library's half-open door, Maria caught glimpses of him pacing behind his mahogany desk, his silver hair disheveled in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. The financial newspapers spread across his desk bore headlines about market corrections and cryptocurrency fluctuations, but his attention seemed scattered, his usual laser focus fractured by concerns that transcended monetary value. "Elizabeth," he said into the phone, and Maria's steps slowed. She had been with the family long enough to recognize the particular tone that entered his voice when he spoke of his daughter. Love and worry tangled together, seasoned with the helplessness that even unlimited wealth couldn't cure. Elizabeth was 24, beautiful in the way that old money breeds, elegant bones and eyes that held secrets. But she was also fragile, a delicate creature who seemed to bend under the weight of her father's expectations and the family's public image. Maria continued her morning routine, moving through the mansion's rooms like a ghost who left everything better than she found it. In the conservatory, She tended to the orchids that Elizabeth loved, her calloused fingers gentle against the delicate petals. The greenhouse had become her sanctuary, a place where life flourished under her care despite the cold world beyond its glass walls. Here, surrounded by growing things, she could almost forget the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way the other staff members looked through her as if she were furniture with legs. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Carleton, emerged from the morning room with her usual expression of barely concealed disapproval. She was a woman who wielded her authority like a weapon, quick to criticize and slow to praise. Her accent carried the crisp authority of old money, though Maria suspected she had climbed from humbler beginnings herself. "The roses in the east wing need attention," she said without preamble, "and Mr. Sullivan has requested his breakfast be served in the library instead of the dining room." Maria nodded, accustomed to these abrupt instructions. She understood her place in the household hierarchy. Below the chef? Below the security staff? Certainly below Mrs. Carleton. She was the kind of employee who could be replaced with a phone call, her presence noted mainly when something went wrong. But she had survived worse things than workplace politics. The violence of her childhood home, the betrayal of a husband who had promised to love and protect her, the nights when she had counted coins to buy milk for her children. These experiences had taught her that dignity was something no one could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. As she prepared Robert Sullivan's breakfast, Maria allowed herself to wonder about the man behind the headlines. The business magazines painted him as a visionary, a self-made billionaire whose investments had shaped Chicago's skyline. His real estate portfolio included properties from downtown high-rises to industrial complexes, while his venture capital firm had funded startups that became household names. She had heard the other staff whisper about his collection of rare artwork and vintage cars, assets worth more than entire neighborhoods. But money, Maria knew from experience, could be the cruelest kind of poverty when it replaced human connection. The morning light streaming through the library windows caught the silver in Robert's hair as she entered with his coffee and newspapers. He barely acknowledged her presence, his attention focused on charts and financial projections that meant nothing to her but everything to him. Maria set the tray down with practiced quiet, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands clenched around his phone. Whatever storm was brewing in his world, it went deeper than market fluctuations or investment losses. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway like a shadow given form, her silk robe trailing behind her as she moved with the ethereal quality that had always reminded Maria of smoke. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her usually perfect hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than her 24 years, but also older, aged by something that had nothing to do with time. "Daddy," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying a tremor that made Maria's protective instincts stir. "We need to talk." Robert's head snapped up, his business mask sliding into place with practiced efficiency. "Not now, sweetheart. I have the Tokyo markets opening in 20 minutes, and there's a situation with the cryptocurrency portfolio that requires—" "It's about the foundation," Elizabeth interrupted, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Maria, who'd been arranging the flowers near the window, felt the shift in atmosphere like a change in weather. The Sullivan Family Foundation was Robert's attempt at legacy beyond profit, a charitable organization that funded education programs and community development. It was also, Maria had gradually realized, a source of growing tension between father and daughter. Robert's jaw tightened. "We discussed this. The board made their decision based on financial projections and long-term sustainability. Sometimes doing good requires making hard choices." "Hard choices," Elizabeth repeated, and there was something brittle in her voice. "Like cutting funding for the women's shelter in Pilsen? Like canceling the scholarship program for single mothers? Those are just numbers to you, aren't they? Budget lines that can be erased with a signature." Maria's hands stilled on the flower stems. Pilsen, her neighborhood, where her sister Rosa volunteered at that very shelter, where women like her found refuge and hope when everything else had failed. She had no right to listen to this private conversation, but leaving now would draw attention to her presence. She made herself smaller, invisible, a skill perfected over years of existing on the margins of other people's lives. "Elizabeth, you're being dramatic," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Foundation's resources aren't unlimited. We have to focus on programs that provide the greatest return on investment in terms of social impact." "Social impact?" Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You mean programs that look good in the annual report and make the donors feel virtuous at their charity galas. God forbid we actually help the people who need it most." The argument that followed was conducted in the careful language of people who knew how to wound each other precisely. Maria continued her work, but every word landed like a small stone in still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the room. She thought of Rosa, who stayed late at the shelter every Tuesday night, helping women file police reports and fill out housing applications. She thought of the mothers in her neighborhood who cleaned office buildings at night so their children could dream of college degrees. These were the faces behind Elizabeth's anger, the human cost of boardroom decisions made by people who had never stood in a welfare line or chosen between groceries and rent. When Elizabeth finally left, her footsteps echoing through the marble halls like accusations, Robert remained at his desk with his head in his hands. The powerful man who could move millions with a phone call looked suddenly fragile, as if the weight of his empire had become too much to bear. Maria approached quietly to collect the untouched breakfast, and for a moment their eyes met. "She's right, you know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the Foundation, about everything." Maria paused, unsure if she should respond. In 6 months of employment, he had never addressed her directly about anything more substantial than meal preferences or scheduling changes. But something in his tone invited honesty, and she had learned to recognize the difference between genuine pain and performative emotion. "She loves you," Maria said simply. "Sometimes love makes us say hard things because the easy things don't work anymore." Robert looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not just acknowledging her presence. "You have children," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "2," Maria confirmed, "a boy and a girl." "And their father, he—" Maria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. "Gone. Left when the promises got too hard to keep." The silence that followed was different from the expensive quiet that usually filled the mansion. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who recognized pain in each other, even when their worlds were separated by millions of dollars and entirely different definitions of struggle. Robert cleared his throat, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. "I should get back to work. The markets wait for no one." Maria nodded and withdrew, but something had changed between them, a small crack in the wall that money had built around his heart. As she carried the tray to the kitchen, she wondered what it would take to widen that crack into something that might let light in. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of household tasks. Maria polished silver that gleamed like captured moonlight, dusted artwork worth more than houses, and tended to details that the family took for granted. The other staff members moved around her with professional efficiency, but she remained apart. Not cruel exclusion exactly, but the kind of casual dismissal that hurt more than deliberate meanness. Mrs. Carleton appeared in the kitchen as Maria was preparing lunch, her expression troubled. "There's been a change in schedule," she announced to the assembled staff. "Miss Elizabeth has canceled her appointments for today. She's requested meals be sent to her room, and she's not to be disturbed unless there's an emergency." The chef, a temperamental man named Claude who treated his kitchen like a sacred space, muttered something about inconsiderate rich people and their moods. The day butler rolled his eyes and made a comment about spoiled children who didn't understand the value of routine. But Maria said nothing, remembering the fragility she had seen in Elizabeth's face, the way her voice had cracked when she spoke about the Foundation. As afternoon faded into evening, the mansion settled into its usual quiet. Robert remained closeted in his library, conducting business across time zones while the Chicago wind howled against the windows. The other staff members completed their duties, and retreated to their separate worlds, leaving Maria to finish the day's final tasks. She was arranging fresh flowers in the main hallway when she heard it, a sound so soft it was almost lost in the whisper of heated air moving through vents. Crying. Someone was crying with the careful quiet of a person who had learned not to expect comfort. Following the sound, Maria found herself outside Elizabeth's bedroom door. She stood there for a long moment, torn between professional boundaries and human compassion. The crying continued, broken and desolate, and something inside Maria's chest twisted with recognition. She had cried like that many nights after Miguel left, muffling her sobs in pillows so her children wouldn't hear their mother break. She knocked softly, just 3 gentle taps that could be ignored if necessary. "Go away." Elizabeth's voice came through the door, thick with tears and defiance. "It's Maria," she said quietly. "I brought you some tea." There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps crossing the room. The door opened to reveal Elizabeth's tear-streaked face, her carefully constructed composure completely abandoned. She looked like what she was, a young woman overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and expectation. "I don't want tea," Elizabeth said, but she stepped aside to let Maria enter. The bedroom was a study in controlled chaos. Clothes were scattered across the king-sized bed, and papers from the foundation were spread across the writing desk like fallen leaves. The room smelled of expensive perfume and misery, a combination that broke Maria's heart. "Sometimes we don't want the things we need most," Maria said, setting the tea tray on the nightstand. She had added honey and a sprig of mint from the greenhouse, small touches that transformed a simple beverage into something approaching care. Elizabeth laughed, but it was the sound of someone fighting back fresh tears. "You don't understand. Nobody understands." "Try me," Maria said, settling into the chair near the window. Her tone was gentle but firm, carrying the authority that came from years of talking frightened children through nightmares and broken hearts. And slowly, with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned not to trust easily, Elizabeth began to talk. She spoke about growing up in the shadow of her father's empire, where every friendship was suspect and every relationship felt transactional. She talked about the pressure to be perfect, to represent the family name with grace and dignity while hiding any trace of human weakness. She described the loneliness of wealth, how money created barriers even as it opened doors. But mostly, she talked about the foundation and her growing awareness of how their charitable giving reflected their values, or lack thereof. She had visited the programs they funded, had seen the careful presentations designed to showcase success while hiding messier realities. She had also seen the programs they chose not to fund, the unglamorous work of helping people who would never be featured in annual reports or donor newsletters. "The women's shelter in Pilsen," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. "Do you know what they do there? They don't just provide beds and meals. They help women learn to believe in themselves again. They help them understand that being hit doesn't mean being worthless. They teach job skills and English classes and how to navigate social services. It's not glamorous work, and it doesn't produce the kind of success stories that look good in fundraising materials." Maria listened without judgment, recognizing in Elizabeth's pain the same frustration she had felt watching her neighbors struggle with an abusive husband while social services remained overwhelmed and underfunded. The girl was crying for injustices she was just beginning to understand, for a world where good intentions mattered less than good optics. "But my father," Elizabeth continued, "he looks at everything through spreadsheets and cost-benefit analyses. The shelter serves mostly undocumented women, women who won't become poster children for our charitable work. Their stories are too complicated, too political. It's easier to fund literacy programs and community gardens, nice, safe causes that everyone can feel good about supporting." As Elizabeth spoke, Maria began to understand the depth of the conflict between father and daughter. It wasn't just disagreement about charitable giving. It was a fundamental difference in how they saw the world and their responsibility to it. Robert viewed philanthropy as part of his business portfolio, an investment in his legacy and social standing. Elizabeth saw it as a moral obligation, a chance to use their privilege to address real suffering. "What does your father say when you try to explain this to him?" Maria asked. Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving mascara smudges that made her look even younger. "He says I'm naive, that I don't understand how the world works, that sometimes you have to make hard choices to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people." "And what do you say?" "I say that the greatest good isn't always the most efficient good, that sometimes helping one person completely is worth more than helping 100 people, just a little bit." Elizabeth's voice gained strength as she spoke, revealing the conviction that poverty and suffering demanded more than mathematical solutions. Maria nodded, thinking of her sister Rosa and the women who sought shelter, not because they wanted handouts, but because they needed a chance to rebuild their lives with safety and dignity. She thought of her own children, who had learned resilience not from motivational speeches, but from watching their mother refuse to give up when everything seemed hopeless. "Your father loves you," Maria said finally. "Sometimes powerful people forget that love means listening, not just providing." Elizabeth looked at her with surprise, as if the idea that the family maid might understand love and loss was revolutionary. "How do you know so much about powerful people?" Maria smiled sadly. "Because I've been invisible to them my whole life. When people don't see you, you learn to see them very clearly." They sat in comfortable quiet for a moment, sipping tea while the winter wind rattled the windows. Outside, Chicago stretched toward the horizon in a grid of lights and possibilities. But inside the mansion, two women from different worlds found common ground in their understanding of what it meant to feel unheard. "There's something else," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even my father." Maria waited, recognizing the particular tension that preceded difficult confessions. "I've been getting threats," Elizabeth continued. "Phone calls, mostly. Sometimes letters. Someone who knows about the foundation decisions, who knows about the private meetings and the cuts to funding. They say they're going to make me pay for what my family has done." The room suddenly felt colder, and Maria set down her teacup with careful control. "Have you gone to the police?" Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And tell them what? That someone is angry about charitable funding decisions? That I'm receiving vague threats that might just be from desperate people who have every right to be furious with us? My father would have them investigated, probably arrested. He'd turn their anger into evidence of criminality, instead of addressing the injustice that caused it." "But you're scared," Maria observed. "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted. "Not just of the threats, but of what they represent. Of the possibility that everything I've believed about my family's goodness might be a lie. That we're not the philanthropists we pretend to be, but just another wealthy family using charity to cleanse our conscience while perpetuating the systems that create the problems we claim to solve." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January weather outside. She recognized the particular kind of fear that came from realizing that the people you trusted most might be the source of your danger, not your protection. It was the same fear she had felt in the months before Miguel left, when love had curdled into something unrecognizable and the person who was supposed to keep you safe became the person you needed safety from. "What will you do?" Maria asked. Elizabeth's laugh was broken and bitter. "I don't know. I can't keep fighting with my father. It's destroying both of us. But I can't pretend I don't see what I see either. I can't smile and pose for photos while knowing that our decisions are causing real harm to real people." Maria thought of her own children, of the choices she made every day to keep them fed and clothed and believing in the possibility that their lives could be better than hers. She thought of the delicate balance between survival and integrity, the way poverty could force you to compromise your values, while privilege allowed you to maintain them at other people's expense. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the most important choice is not what you do, but who you become while you're doing it." Elizabeth looked at her with something like hope. "What do you mean?" Your father built his fortune by making hard choices, but he forgot that those choices shaped him as much as they shaped his business. You're at the same crossroads now. You can choose to become someone who sees problems as mathematical equations to be solved, or someone who sees them as human experiences to be honored. As the evening deepened into night, Maria helped Elizabeth order her papers and fold her scattered clothes. It was work that fell far outside her job description, but caring for wounded hearts had never been a consideration of employment contracts. As she prepared to leave, Elizabeth caught her hand. "Thank you," she said, and her gratitude was simple and complete. "I haven't talked to anyone about this. Not really talked, I mean. It's strange how someone can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone." Maria nodded, understanding the particular loneliness that came from being seen without being known. "Loneliness isn't about being alone," she said. "It's about being unrecognized for who you really are." That night, as Maria rode the bus back to Pilsen through streets that glittered with ice and possibility, she carried with her the weight of Elizabeth's confessions. The girl was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her relationship with her father, but her understanding of her own moral responsibilities. Maria had seen this moment before, the instant when comfortable beliefs crumbled and forced new truths to be born. In her small apartment, where the radiator clanged with mechanical protest and her children slept in beds she had assembled herself, Maria sat at her kitchen table and thought about the day's revelations. She had been hired to clean and organize the Sullivan mansion, but somehow she had become a witness to the family's unraveling. The girl trusted her with secrets that could destroy her relationship with her father, and the man himself had shown her glimpses of vulnerability that contradicted his public image of unwavering strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between silence and speech, between professional distance and human connection. But tonight, Maria allowed herself to hope that her presence in that cold mansion might serve a purpose larger than maintaining appearances. Perhaps sometimes what wealthy people needed most wasn't another employee, but someone who could see them clearly enough to reflect back their better selves. The winter wind howled outside her windows, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But Maria had weathered many storms, and she knew that sometimes the darkest nights preceded the most beautiful dawns. As she prepared for sleep, she whispered a prayer for Elizabeth, for Robert, and for all the invisible people whose stories were told through the kindness or cruelty of those with power to choose. The morning came gray and bitter, with snow falling like confessions over Chicago's sleeping streets. Maria's alarm clock shrieked at 5:30, the same harsh sound that had marked the beginning of her days for more years than she cared to count. Outside, the city was still wrapped in darkness, but she could hear the distant rumble of early buses and the scrape of snowplows beginning their daily battle against winter's persistence. Her children were still asleep. Diego, 14 and growing into the kind of young man who made her proud and worried in equal measure, and Isabella, 11, and fierce with the determination that reminded Maria of herself at that age. She moved through her morning routine with practiced quiet, brewing coffee in the kitchen that served as the heart of their small world. The radiator knocked and hissed its familiar protest against the cold, and somewhere in the building, Mrs. Morales was already awake, the sound of her telenovelas drifting through thin walls. This was her real world, cramped but warm, poor but honest. Here, she was not invisible. Diego sought her advice about homework and girls with equal embarrassment and trust. Isabella shared secrets and dreams while braiding Maria's hair before work. The neighbors knew her name, asked about her children, borrowed sugar, and offered comfort when bills piled up like accusations on her kitchen table. It was a life measured in small victories and careful compromises, where every dollar was planned and every kindness remembered. The contrast hit her anew every morning when she stepped off the bus at Oak Street Beach. Here, where Lake Michigan stretched toward the horizon like a promise of cleaner worlds, the city dressed itself in wealth and possibility. The mansions along Lakeshore Drive stood like monuments to American dreams realized, their windows glowing with warm light and unlimited electricity bills. Maria walked among them as she had learned to walk through most of her life, carefully, quietly, making herself small enough to avoid unwanted attention. The Sullivan mansion looked different in the morning light, its limestone facade softened by snow that clung to Gothic details and made the building seem less forbidding. But as Maria approached the service entrance, she noticed something that made her steps slow. The security guard was different. Not Thomas, the older man who had worked for the family for 8 years and who nodded at her with genuine warmth, but a stranger whose eyes tracked her movement with professional suspicion. "Good morning, Mrs. Gonzalez," the new guard said, consulting a clipboard that hadn't been there yesterday. "I'll need to see your identification and check your bag before you enter." Maria handed over her ID and opened her purse to reveal its modest contents: wallet, phone, reading glasses, and the small bag of mints she shared with the children when their energy flagged. The guard's search was thorough but professional, and she submitted to it without complaint. Changes in security protocols usually meant changes in the household circumstances, and after yesterday's conversation with Elizabeth, she suspected those circumstances had become more complicated. Inside, the mansion felt different too, tighter somehow, as if the very air carried tension. Mrs. Carlton was waiting in the service hallway, her usual composure strained around the edges. "There are new procedures," she announced without preamble. "All staff movements will be logged and monitored. No one enters family areas without specific authorization. Personal conversations with family members are to be reported to security immediately." The other staff members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their discomfort with these changes. Maria nodded her understanding, but her mind raced with implications. Someone was scared enough to turn their home into a fortress, and she suspected that someone was Robert Sullivan himself. Elizabeth's confession about the threats she had been receiving suddenly seemed less like teenage melodrama and more like legitimate danger. As Maria began her morning routine, she noticed other changes. The usual newspapers and financial journals were absent from Robert's breakfast tray, replaced by security briefings and what appeared to be private investigation reports. The flower arrangements she had prepared yesterday had been moved away from windows, and several pieces of valuable artwork were missing from their usual locations. Even the greenhouse, her sanctuary within the household, showed signs of increased surveillance. New cameras mounted discreetly among the orchids and roses. Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Carlton explained that she was indisposed and would be taking her meals in her room indefinitely. The explanation was delivered with the kind of professional neutrality that discouraged further questions, but Maria heard the worry underneath the composed exterior. Whatever had been building between father and daughter had reached some kind of crisis point. Robert appeared at lunchtime, emerging from his library like a man who had spent the night wrestling with demons. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled as if he had slept in his clothes. The confidence that had built his empire seemed fractured, replaced by the kind of vigilance that came from expecting attack from any direction. Maria served his lunch, a simple soup and salad that he barely touched, and noticed how his hand shook slightly as he reached for his coffee. This was not the composed billionaire whose investment decisions moved markets and whose charitable foundations shaped public policy. This was a frightened father who had realized that all his money couldn't protect the people he loved from forces he couldn't control. "Maria," he said suddenly, his voice rough with exhaustion, "you spoke with Elizabeth yesterday evening. What did she tell you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications. Maria had expected this moment, had prepared for the careful balance between honesty and discretion that her position required. She could lie, claim the conversation had been purely professional, and protect Elizabeth's confidence. Or she could tell the truth and risk betraying the trust of a young woman who had few enough allies in her gilded world. "She's scared," Maria said finally, choosing a truth that honored both father and daughter. "Scared of disappointing you, scared of the changes in her life, scared of not living up to her own values." Robert's laugh was bitter. Her values. As if I don't have values. As if everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed, doesn't represent a lifetime of moral choices. What did you sacrifice? Maria asked, and the question surprised them both with its directness. Robert looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her, not as an employee, but as a person whose judgment might matter. Time, he said finally. Relationships, the luxury of simple choices. When you build something from nothing, every decision carries the weight of everyone who depends on you. Every dollar you don't earn is a scholarship you can't fund, a program you can't support, a family you can't help. Maria nodded, understanding more than he might expect. But who was helping you while you were helping everyone else? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared at her for a long moment, as if she had spoken in a foreign language that he was only beginning to translate. Outside, snow continued to fall over Chicago, covering the city in fresh white that made everything look clean and possible. No one, he said, finally. That's what building an empire means. You become responsible for everyone else's dreams, while your own get buried under the weight of success. Maria thought of her children, of the dreams she carried for them that sustained her through double shifts and broken promises. She thought of Elizabeth, whose wealth couldn't cure her loneliness, and of Robert, whose power couldn't protect him from helplessness. Money, she was beginning to understand, was just another kind of trap when it became the only language people knew how to speak. Elizabeth loves you, she said quietly. But sometimes love gets lost in translation when one person speaks in numbers and another speaks in hearts. Robert's composure cracked just slightly, revealing the exhausted man beneath the businessman's mask. The foundation isn't just charity, he said. It's complicated. The tax implications, the political considerations, the way every donation affects our relationships with other organizations and government agencies. She sees helping people as simple: identify need, provide resources, solve problems. But when you're dealing with millions of dollars and hundreds of programs, simple solutions create complex consequences. Maybe, Maria said carefully, the real question isn't whether the solutions are simple or complex, but whether they're human or mathematical. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Robert stared at her with the expression of someone encountering a new idea that challenged fundamental assumptions. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the mansion with promises of worse weather to come. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Carleton's hurried entrance. Her usual composure was completely gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice tight with strain. "There's a situation with Miss Elizabeth. She's not in her room, and security can't locate her anywhere in the house." The transformation in Robert was immediate and terrible. The tired father disappeared, replaced by a man whose empire was under attack. He was on his feet before Mrs. Carleton finished speaking, his phone already in his hand as he began issuing orders to security personnel and private investigators. "Check the garage, check the surveillance footage from the last 12 hours, he commanded, his voice cutting through the suddenly charged atmosphere. "Contact the security service, have them run traces on her phone and credit cards. I want to know where she is and how long she's been gone." Maria stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, forgotten in the urgency of family crisis. But as the staff scattered to follow Robert's orders, she found herself thinking about yesterday's conversation with Elizabeth. The girl's fear hadn't been theoretical. It had been immediate and personal. She had been preparing for something, making some kind of decision that required courage Maria wasn't sure she possessed. "When was she last seen?" Robert demanded, and Mrs. Carleton consulted her notes with shaking hands. Security logged her movements until approximately 11 p.m. last night. She requested dinner be sent to her room, which was delivered at 7:30. But when the day staff attempted to deliver breakfast this morning, there was no response. We assumed she was sleeping late, given the stress of recent events. Robert's face went pale as he calculated the hours. Elizabeth had been missing for at least 10 hours, possibly longer. In a city like Chicago in the middle of winter, with people angry enough to make threats against the family, 10 hours represented a lifetime of potential disasters. "Sir," one of the security guards said, approaching with the careful demeanor of someone delivering bad news. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage. Miss Elizabeth left the property at approximately 2 a.m. using the service entrance. She appeared to be carrying a small bag and was dressed for cold weather." The words hit the room like physical blows. Elizabeth had not been kidnapped or coerced. She had left voluntarily in the middle of the night without telling anyone where she was going. The implications were staggering, not just for her safety, but for what her departure might mean about her relationship with her father and her state of mind. "The threats," Robert said, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. She was more frightened than she let on. She ran because she thought staying was more dangerous than leaving. Maria felt her heart break for both father and daughter. Elizabeth, alone in the winter city with whatever demons had driven her from home, and Robert realizing that his attempts to protect his daughter had instead convinced her that protection was impossible. She thought of her own children, of the fierce love that sometimes held too tightly and pushed away the very people it meant to save. "We need to find her," Robert continued, his voice gaining the commanding tone that had built his business empire. "Contact every hotel in the city, every shelter, every place she might go for help. Check social media, monitor her online accounts, track down her friends and classmates. Someone knows where she is." As the mansion filled with security personnel and investigators, Maria retreated to the kitchen, overwhelmed by the chaos, but unwilling to abandon her post. The other staff members whispered among themselves, sharing theories and concerns, while carefully avoiding any criticism of the family that employed them. But Maria said nothing, turning over in her mind the details of her conversation with Elizabeth. The girl had been scared, but her fear had been specific, not just about physical threats, but about the moral conflict that was tearing her apart. She had spoken about feeling trapped between her father's expectations and her own conscience, about the impossibility of reconciling love for family with recognition of injustice. Her departure wasn't random panic. It was a calculated escape from an impossible situation. But where would a wealthy young woman go when running from wealth? Elizabeth's privileged life had few connection points with the parts of Chicago where someone could disappear without money and influence reaching them. Unless. Maria thought about Elizabeth's passionate defense of the women's shelter in Pilsen, her detailed knowledge of programs that served undocumented immigrants and abuse survivors. The girl hadn't just been arguing about funding decisions. She had been speaking from personal knowledge of the people and places her family's choices affected. She had been there, had seen for herself the work that was being done and the work that was being denied resources. As afternoon faded toward evening and the search efforts intensified without success, Maria made a decision that could cost her job and change her life. She approached Mrs. Carleton during a brief lull in the chaos. "I need to speak with Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly. "I think I might know where Elizabeth went." Mrs. Carleton looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Are you certain? This isn't the time for speculation or false hopes." "I'm certain," Maria said, though her heart was pounding with the magnitude of what she was about to do. "But I need to speak with him alone." 10 minutes later, Maria stood in Robert Sullivan's library, surrounded by the symbols of his success and the evidence of his current desperation. Financial newspapers lay scattered across his desk next to security reports and missing person protocols. His phone rang constantly with updates from investigators and security personnel, each call bringing more questions instead of answers. "Mrs. Carleton says you have information about Elizabeth," he said without preamble. His exhaustion was visible now, the adrenaline of crisis management giving way to the deeper fatigue of a father's fear. "I think she went to Pilsen," Maria said. "To the women's shelter." Robert stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "The shelter? Why would she go there?" "Because it represents everything she was trying to tell you about," Maria said carefully. Because it's a place where people help each other without asking for anything in return. Because it's the opposite of everything that scared her about your world. The explanation sounded inadequate even as she spoke it, but Maria pressed on, knowing that Elizabeth's safety might depend on her father understanding the girl's state of mind. She felt trapped, Maria continued, between loving you and fighting with you, between wanting to help people and feeling like your money was part of the problem. The shelter represents clarity for her, a place where helping people doesn't require complicated calculations about tax benefits and political consequences. Robert's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been understanding. Outside, Chicago glittered with evening lights that promised warmth and safety, but delivered neither to those without resources to claim them. "You think my daughter is staying at a homeless shelter?" he said slowly. "You think she chose homelessness over living with me?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Maria thought of her own teenagers, of the ways love could feel like pressure and protection, like imprisonment when you were struggling to define yourself. "I think she chose truth over comfort," Maria said finally, "even if the truth is harder to live with." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock and the distant hum of city traffic. Robert stood at the window, staring out at the lights of Chicago as if they might reveal the secrets of his daughter's heart. "Will you take me there?" he asked finally. The question was simple, but Maria understood its complexity. Robert Sullivan had spent decades insulated from the parts of Chicago where his daughter might be hiding. He knew the boardrooms and country clubs, the charity galas and political fundraisers, but the shelters and community centers existed outside his direct experience. He needed guide not just to navigate the geography, but to understand the cultural and emotional landscape that his daughter had chosen over his world. "Yes," Maria said, "but we go my way, in my neighborhood, by my rules. If she's there because she feels safe. We can't destroy that safety just because we want to bring her home." Robert nodded, and Maria saw in his face the kind of surrender that preceded wisdom. The man who commanded investment portfolios and influenced political decisions was abating his authority to a maid who understood his daughter's heart better than he did. As they prepared to leave the mansion, Maria thought about the courage it took to choose truth over comfort, justice over security. Elizabeth had made that choice, abandoning privilege for principle. Now her father faced the same crossroads, with the stakes being not just money or reputation, but the love between father and daughter. The snow continued to fall over Chicago, covering the city in fresh possibility. Somewhere in its depths, a young woman was discovering what she could become when stripped of everything except her values. And in a mansion on Lakeshore Drive, her father was beginning to understand that finding her would require more than money or influence. It would require the courage to see the world through her eyes. The drive to Pilsen passed in strained silence, Robert's luxury sedan cutting through Chicago's west side like an intrusion from another world. Maria sat in the passenger seat, acutely aware of how her worn coat contrasted with the car's leather interior, how her neighborhood would look to someone accustomed to manicured lawns and private security. But her discomfort was nothing compared to Robert's visible tension as they moved farther from his familiar territory. The streets grew narrower, the buildings lower and more colorful. Murals bloomed on brick walls like flowers, depicting scenes of struggle and hope that spoke to experiences Robert had never known. Corner stores with Spanish signs shared blocks with community centers and churches, creating a tapestry of daily life that existed entirely outside his experience. Maria watched him process the sensory overload, the sound of multiple languages mixing on sidewalks, the smell of food from a dozen different cultures, the sight of children playing in small parks despite the cold. "It's different than I expected," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Different how?" Maria asked. Robert was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of teenagers help an elderly woman carry groceries up icy steps. "More human, I suppose. When you hear about poverty in board meetings, it's all statistics and demographics. But this, he gestured toward the window, this is just people living their lives. Maria nodded, understanding what he meant, but also recognizing what he didn't yet see. Pilsen wasn't poverty as much as it was community. People who had learned to rely on each other because they couldn't rely on systems that weren't designed for them. It was a place where neighbors noticed when you were struggling and where children learned responsibility by watching adults work multiple jobs to build better futures. The Casa de Esperanza shelter occupied a converted church building, its Gothic windows now illuminated by warm fluorescent light instead of stained glass. A small sign identified it in both English and Spanish, and the parking lot showed evidence of constant use. Cars and buses dropping off women and children who needed more than shelter from Chicago's cruel winter. "This is where you think Elizabeth came?" Robert asked, staring at the building as if it were an alien landscape. "This is where she came to understand what her family's foundation meant to real people," Maria said. "She volunteered here, spending time with women who were rebuilding their lives from nothing. She saw what happened when funding got cut, when programs disappeared because they weren't politically palatable or photogenic enough for donor newsletters." As they approached the building, Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied moments when worlds collided. Her professional life in the Sullivan mansion existed in careful separation from her personal life in Pilsen, but now those boundaries were dissolving. Robert Sullivan, with his expensive coat and obvious discomfort, was about to enter a space where her sister Rosa volunteered, where neighbors she had known for years sought refuge from violence and poverty. The woman at the front desk looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from professional welcome to careful assessment. She recognized Maria immediately, Rosa's sister, the one who worked for rich people but still showed up for quinceañeras and funeral masses. But Robert was clearly unfamiliar territory, his wealth marking him as either potential donor or potential threat. "Mrs. Gonzalez," she said in Spanish, then switched to accented English. "How can we help you tonight?" "We're looking for someone," Maria replied, also in English for Robert's benefit. "A young woman who might have come here in the last day or two. Elizabeth Sullivan." The recognition was immediate and telling. The desk volunteer's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and Maria knew they had found the right place. Elizabeth was here, or had been recently, and her presence had made an impression. "I need to check with my supervisor," the volunteer said carefully. "Can you wait here, please?" As they settled into plastic chairs in the lobby, Maria observed Robert taking in details that probably seemed foreign and unsettling. The bilingual posters about domestic violence resources, the children's drawings covering one wall, the sound of multiple conversations in different languages drifting from common areas. This was help without glamour, charity without gala dinners, the kind of work that happened because it needed to happen rather than because it looked good in annual reports. "She's here," Robert said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Maria confirmed, "but that doesn't mean she's ready to see you." Before Robert could respond, Rosa appeared from one of the back offices. She was smaller than Maria, but carried herself with the same quiet dignity, her hair pulled back severely, and her face showing the fatigue that came from working double shifts as a hospital cleaner and then volunteering at the shelter. "Maria," she said, embracing her sister with genuine warmth, before turning curious eyes to Robert. "What are you doing here? And who is your friend?" The question was asked in Spanish, but Robert didn't need translation to understand the protective scrutiny. Rosa had spent enough time around powerful men to recognize both potential allies and threats, and she wasn't yet sure which category Robert occupied. "Rosa, this is Mr. Sullivan," Maria said, switching to English. "We're looking for his daughter, Elizabeth. We think she might be staying here." Rosa's expression shifted through several emotions quickly: surprise, recognition, and something that looked like resignation. The rich girl who's been helping in the kitchen and sleeping on a cot with the other women? The one who cries at night but won't talk about why? The description hit Robert like a physical blow. His daughter, who had never slept anywhere less luxurious than a four-star hotel, who had been raised with every comfort money could provide, had chosen a cot in a shelter over the safety of her father's mansion. "She's been crying?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Rosa studied him carefully, evidently making some internal calculation about trustworthiness and intent. "She cries like someone whose heart is breaking," she said finally, "like someone who loves people they can't protect." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond Elizabeth's physical location. She wasn't just hiding from threats or running from family conflict. She was grieving for a world that her privilege had both protected her from and prevented her from helping. "Can we see her?" Robert asked, and Maria heard in his voice the pleading that no amount of wealth could disguise. Rosa exchanged a look with Maria, some silent sister communication passing between them. Then she nodded slowly. "She's in the kitchen, helping with dinner. But Mr. Sullivan, she came here because she needed space to think. If you push too hard, you'll lose her completely." They followed Rosa through corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and home cooking, past classrooms where women practiced English and job interview skills, past dormitories where children did homework under fluorescent lights. It was a glimpse into a world that existed parallel to Robert's daily experience, but might as well have been on another planet. The kitchen was a study in organized chaos. Volunteer cooks preparing meals for 70 people with limited resources and unlimited determination. Steam rose from large pots while conversations flowed in 3 different languages. And children too young for formal responsibilities helped by setting tables and folding napkins. Elizabeth stood at one of the prep stations, her blonde hair covered by a hairnet and her expensive clothes replaced by an apron that had seen better days. She was chopping vegetables with the focused intensity of someone trying to lose herself in simple tasks, her movements efficient, but somehow desperate. Even from across the room, Maria could see the exhaustion in her posture and the evidence of tears on her face. "Elizabeth," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at the sound, and her face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalogue. Surprise, fear, relief, and anger, all competing for dominance. The knife in her hand trembled slightly, and Maria noticed that her father's sudden appearance had the attention of every other person in the kitchen. "Daddy," Elizabeth said, and the word carried years of complicated love and frustration. "How did you find me?" Maria figured out where you'd gone," Robert replied, taking a careful step closer. "We've been worried sick. The whole house, all the security people, half of Chicago's police force is looking for you." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "Of course they are. Can't have the Sullivan heiress slumming with the poor people. Think of what the newspapers would say." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Maria watched Robert struggle with his response. She could see him calculating political implications and public relations consequences, the automatic mental processes that had guided his business decisions for decades. But she could also see him fighting those instincts, trying to focus on his daughter's pain instead of its potential impact on family reputation. "I don't care about the newspapers," he said finally. "I care about you. I care that you're safe and that you come home." "Home to what?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Home to more arguments about money and morality. Home to a foundation that talks about helping people while making decisions that hurt them. Home to a family that measures success in dollars instead of lives changed." The words hit like accusations, and Maria saw several of the other volunteers suppressing smiles of approval. Elizabeth might be a rich girl playing at poverty, but her anger about injustice was real, and her presence in the kitchen was making a difference. She had been helping to feed people while her father's foundation decided they weren't worthy of assistance. "Elizabeth, please," Robert said, and Maria heard in his voice the helplessness that came from realizing that money couldn't solve every problem. "Can we talk about this at home? Privately." "We tried talking privately," Elizabeth replied, wiping her hands on her apron with sharp, angry movements. "You explained to me why we couldn't help the shelter, why we had to focus on more sustainable programs, why helping undocumented women wasn't worth the political complications. Remember that conversation, Daddy? Because I do. Rosa moved closer to Maria, speaking quietly in Spanish. This has been building for 2 days. She works like someone trying to outrun ghosts, but she won't talk about what happened to make her leave. Maria nodded, understanding that Elizabeth's presence at the shelter was about more than family conflict. The girl had been running from something specific, some threat or realization that had made staying home feel impossible. "What happened, mija?" Maria asked gently, using the Spanish endearment without thinking. "What made you leave in the middle of the night?" Elizabeth looked at her with something like gratitude, as if Maria's question acknowledged complexities that her father's presence seemed to dismiss. "They found me," she said quietly. "The people who had been making threats. They found me at the house." Saad. The kitchen went completely silent, conversations stopping mid-sentence as the gravity of Elizabeth's words settled over the room. Robert's face went pale, his businessman's composure cracking to reveal raw fear. "What do you mean they found you?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Elizabeth's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain events that had terrified her enough to flee her father's protection. "There was a man," she said, her voice shaking. "He got past security somehow, was waiting in the greenhouse when I went to water the plants. He said the Foundation's decisions had consequences, that people were suffering because of choices my family made. He said if we wouldn't listen to reason, maybe we'd listen to fear." The words hit the kitchen like physical blows, and Maria felt her own heart racing as she imagined the scene. The greenhouse had been Elizabeth's sanctuary within the mansion, the one place where she could find peace amid family chaos. Having that safety violated would have been devastating enough without the implied threat. "Did he hurt you?" Robert demanded, taking another step closer to his daughter. "He didn't have to," Elizabeth replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He knew things, about my schedule, about the family's private business, about conversations we'd had behind closed doors. He said that money couldn't protect people who didn't deserve protection. The privilege was just borrowed time before justice came calling." Rosa made a soft sound of sympathy and moved toward Elizabeth with the kind of protective instinct that transcended language and class barriers. She had worked with enough frightened women to recognize trauma beneath anger, vulnerability beneath defiance. "And then what happened, mija?" Rosa asked gently. "I didn't tell anyone," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger with confession. "I was afraid Daddy would overreact, would turn the house into an armed camp and make the threats into reality. I thought if I just disappeared for a while, let things cool down, maybe I could figure out how to fix everything without making it worse." Robert looked stricken, realizing that his daughter had protected him by endangering herself. The fortress mentality that had guided his response to the initial threats had actually driven Elizabeth away, making her feel that his protection came at too high a cost to other people. "But you can't fix this by running away," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You can't solve systemic problems by putting yourself at risk. And you can't solve them by hiding behind money either," Elizabeth replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier anger. "When I've been here, working with women who have real problems, abuse, deportation, homelessness, our foundation debates seem ridiculous. We're arguing about helping people while they're fighting just to survive another day." The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Sister Margaret, the shelter's director, a woman whose authority came not from wealth or position, but from decades of service to Chicago's most vulnerable residents. She looked at Robert with the kind of assessment reserved for potential allies or threats, clearly trying to determine which category he occupied. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the Irish accent that had never quite faded despite 40 years in America. "Your daughter has been a gift to us these past 2 days. She has worked harder than volunteers with years of experience, and she has listened to stories that most people with her background would find difficult to hear. The words were carefully chosen, Maria realized. Praise for Elizabeth that also carried gentle criticism of the world she came from. Sister Margaret was defending the girl while challenging the father to see beyond his own assumptions about charity and service. "I'm grateful she was safe here," Robert replied, his voice carefully respectful. "But I need to take her home now. There are security concerns that—" "Security concerns," Sister Margaret interrupted, and her tone carried decades of frustration with people who tried to solve complex problems through simple application of resources. "Mr. Sullivan, your daughter is afraid not just of the people making threats, but of what those threats represent. She's afraid that your family's wealth has created more problems than it's solved." The words landed like punches, forcing Robert to confront implications he had been avoiding. His empire had been built through capitalism's standard practices, maximizing returns while minimizing costs, making strategic decisions based on mathematical rather than moral calculations. But Elizabeth had begun to see those decisions through the eyes of people they affected, and the view was damaging her relationship not just with him, but with herself. "I don't know how to fix this," Robert said finally, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. "I've spent my whole life building something I thought would make the world better, but my daughter sees it as part of the problem. How do I reconcile that?" Elizabeth looked at him with something that might have been hope, as if his confusion was the first honest thing he had said about the situation. "Maybe," she said quietly, "you stop trying to reconcile it and start trying to understand it." As the evening deepened around them, Maria watched a family begin the difficult process of rebuilding trust across philosophical and emotional chasms that money couldn't bridge. Elizabeth's flight to the shelter had been about more than physical safety. It had been about finding a place where her values aligned with her actions, where helping people didn't require complicated calculations about political consequences. But now, surrounded by the warm chaos of the shelter kitchen and the evidence of work that needed doing, father and daughter were beginning to find common ground in their shared recognition that something in their world needed to change. The conversation continued for another hour, moving from the kitchen to Sister Margaret's small office, where financial reports competed for desk space with children's drawings and thank you cards from former residents. Elizabeth explained her volunteer work in detail, not just the physical tasks of cooking and cleaning, but the stories she had heard, and the women she had met who were rebuilding their lives with courage and determination. Robert listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for investment presentations, but Maria could see him struggling to translate what he was hearing into frameworks he understood. This wasn't business. There were no metrics for measuring rebuilt self-esteem, no quarterly reports on healing from trauma. The work of the shelter succeeded through accumulation of small victories that would never appear in annual reports or donor newsletters. "The woman in bed 7, Elizabeth said, her voice soft with controlled emotion. "Maria. Not you, Maria. Another Maria. She came here 3 weeks ago with 2 children and nothing else. Her husband had controlled every dollar, every decision, every moment of her life. She didn't even know how to use an ATM because he had never allowed her to touch money." Robert nodded, but Maria could see the disconnect in his expression. Domestic abuse was a concept he understood intellectually, but the practical implications, the way financial control became psychological prison, was foreign to his experience. "Now she's working part-time at a retail job while taking English classes at night," Elizabeth continued. "She's saving money for an apartment, learning to make decisions without permission, teaching her children that there are different ways to be a family. And you know what the most important thing is?" "What?" Robert asked. "Nobody asks her to prove she deserves help. Nobody makes her jump through hoops or demonstrate that she'll use assistance appropriately. She gets help because she needs help, period." The contrast with traditional charitable models was clear, and Maria saw Robert beginning to understand his daughter's frustration with foundation policies that required extensive documentation and proof of worthiness before providing assistance. The shelter operated on an assumption of human dignity that didn't need to be earned or justified. But sustainability, Robert began, then stopped himself as he realized he was falling back into familiar arguments. Sustainability is important, Elizabeth agreed, but it can't be the only consideration. Some problems require immediate response, even if the long-term solutions are still being developed. Sister Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with the possibility of finding an ally in an unexpected place. Mr. Sullivan, what if the question isn't whether to help, but how to help most effectively? What if your resources could be leveraged not just to provide services, but to change the systems that create the need for services? It was a perspective that bridged the gap between Robert's business mindset and Elizabeth's humanitarian instincts, and Maria saw both father and daughter responding to the possibility it represented. Instead of choosing between efficiency and compassion, they could choose to be both strategic and humane. "What would that look like practically?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the first genuine interest he had shown since arriving at the shelter. The conversation that followed was the kind that changes lives and shapes legacies. Sister Margaret described the policy advocacy work that happened alongside direct services, the ways that individual assistance could inform broader efforts to address root causes of poverty and violence. Elizabeth spoke about the women she had met who needed not just temporary help, but systemic change. Immigration reform, affordable housing programs, childcare policies that recognize the reality of working mothers' lives. Robert listened with the intensity he brought to major business decisions, but Maria could see him processing information through new paradigms. His daughter hadn't been rejecting his values. She'd been challenging him to expand his definition of success to include measures that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. "There's something else," Elizabeth said, as the night grew later. "The threats I received, they weren't from random, angry people. They were from someone who knew our private business, who had access to information about Foundation decisions that hadn't been made public yet." Robert's attention sharpened immediately, his protective instincts overriding philosophical discussions. "What kind of information?" "Details about which programs were being cut, which organizations were losing funding, even quotes from private conversations we had about the political implications of certain donations." Elizabeth's voice was steady, but Maria could hear underlying fear. Whoever is making threats has inside access to family business. The realization hit the room like cold air, transforming abstract discussions about charity into immediate concerns about safety and betrayal. Someone close to the family was either feeding information to hostile parties or was themselves the source of threats against Elizabeth. "We need to go home," Robert said, his voice tight with new worry. "If there's a security breach this serious, staying here puts everyone at risk. Not just you, but everyone in this building." Elizabeth looked around the shelter office, at the evidence of work that would continue regardless of her family's personal drama, and Maria saw her struggling with competing loyalties. She had found purpose in service and couldn't bear the thought of abandoning it for abstract security concerns. "What if," Sister Margaret said carefully, "we found ways to continue the work that also address the security issues? What if this situation became an opportunity rather than just a problem?" The suggestion hung in the air like possibility, and Maria felt the particular tension that preceded important decisions. Elizabeth's flight to the shelter had revealed fractures in the Sullivan family that went deeper than disagreements about charitable giving, but it had also created an opportunity for healing those fractures through shared service to others. "You mean like a partnership between the Foundation and the shelter?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tentative with hope. "I mean like a commitment to do charity differently," Sister Margaret replied. "To fund programs based on effectiveness rather than convenience, to make decisions based on need rather than political calculation, to measure success by lives changed rather than dollars donated." Robert was quiet for a long moment, his businessman's mind running calculations that were more complex than financial projections. The partnership Sister Margaret was suggesting would require changes not just in how the Foundation operated, but in how he understood his responsibility to use wealth ethically. "It would mean giving up control," he said finally. "Trusting people who understand problems I've never experienced to make decisions about how my money gets spent." "It would mean sharing control," Elizabeth corrected gently. "Combining your resources with other people's expertise to accomplish things neither could do alone." As they prepared to leave the shelter, Maria reflected on the evening's revelations. Elizabeth's rebellion against her father's world had led not to permanent separation, but to the possibility of transformation for both of them. The girl's courage in confronting systemic problems had challenged her father to see beyond conventional approaches to charity, while his resources could amplify the shelter's impact in ways previously impossible. But the threats against Elizabeth remained real, and someone close to the family was betraying confidences that put lives at risk. Finding that person would require the same kind of strategic thinking that had built Robert's empire, applied to protecting the people he loved rather than maximizing returns on investment. The drive back to Lakeshore Drive passed in contemplative quiet, each passenger processing the evening's revelations. Elizabeth sat between Maria and her father, physically and symbolically bridging the gap between their worlds. She had found herself through service to others, but now faced the challenge of maintaining that sense of purpose within the context of family reconciliation. As they approached the mansion, Maria noticed additional security vehicles and increased lighting around the property. Robert's response to Elizabeth's disappearance had been to fortify his kingdom, but the evening at the shelter had suggested alternative approaches to safety, community-based solutions that protected people through connection rather than isolation. "Tomorrow," Elizabeth said as they pulled into the driveway, "I want to start working on a proposal for the foundation partnership with Casa de Esperanza, something concrete that we can present to the board." Robert nodded, his agreement carrying weight of surrendered control and newfound trust. "Tomorrow," he said, "we also need to find out who's been sharing private family information with people who want to hurt us." The priorities were clear: rebuild trust through shared work while identifying the source of threats that had driven them apart. It was a delicate balance between moving forward and resolving the past, but Maria sensed that the Sullivan family was ready for both challenges. As they entered the mansion, warmed by the possibility of new understanding, Maria allowed herself to hope that her small role in bringing father and daughter together might contribute to something larger. A transformation not just of their relationship, but of how power could be exercised with compassion and how wealth could serve justice rather than just convenience. The mansion felt different when they returned, as if Elizabeth's absence had revealed its essential emptiness, and her presence was slowly restoring its capacity for warmth. The security personnel who had spent the day searching for her retreated to their posts with visible relief, though the additional precautions remained in place. Maria noticed how the increased surveillance made the house feel more like a fortress and less like a home, another reminder that safety achieved through isolation came at the cost of human connection. Robert called an immediate meeting with his head of security, a former FBI agent named Walter Hayes, who had managed the family's protection for 8 years. Hayes was a man who understood threats in practical terms, risks that could be assessed, mitigated, and managed through proper protocols and adequate resources. But Elizabeth's situation presented challenges that went beyond conventional security measures. "The breach is significant," Hayes reported, his voice carrying the crisp authority that came from decades of law enforcement experience. "Whoever provided information about private foundation business had access to confidential board discussions and internal family communications. That narrows the potential sources to fewer than a dozen people." The implications were staggering, and Maria watched Robert process the reality that his inner circle included someone willing to betray family trust for unknown motives. Business competition was one thing. He had navigated corporate espionage and hostile takeovers throughout his career, but threats against his daughter represented a different category of violation, one that transformed professional disagreements into personal warfare. "I want complete background checks on everyone with access to foundation information," Robert said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Financial records, communication patterns, Any personal or professional pressures that might make someone vulnerable to outside influence. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Maria recognized the particular tension that came from watching family relationships reduced to security assessments. The girl had spent 2 days working alongside people who trusted each other despite having every reason to be suspicious, and returning to a world where loyalty had to be verified through investigation reports was jarring. "Daddy?" Elizabeth said carefully. "What if the problem isn't finding the traitor but addressing the issues that made someone angry enough to threaten us in the first place?" "Here." Hayes looked at her with the kind of expression reserved for civilians who didn't understand security protocols. "Miss Sullivan, addressing root causes is a long-term solution. Right now, we need to focus on immediate threat mitigation." "But what if those aren't separate problems?" Elizabeth pressed. "What if the threats are coming from people who have legitimate grievances about Foundation decisions, and the information is being shared by someone who agrees with their concerns?" The question hung in the air like smoke, forcing everyone to consider possibilities that complicated simple narratives of betrayal and security. Maria had spent enough time in boardrooms to recognize the moment when assumptions get challenged by inconvenient truths, and she could see Hayes struggling with the implications of Elizabeth's perspective. "You're suggesting that someone on your father's staff is sympathetic to people making threats against you?" Hayes asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm suggesting that someone on his staff might understand why people are angry enough to make threats," Elizabeth replied. "And maybe they're sharing information not to help enemies but to force accountability." Robert looked stricken by the possibility, and Maria understood why. His daughter was suggesting that the betrayal might be motivated not by personal animus or financial gain, but by moral conviction. Someone close to them had decided that family loyalty was less important than preventing harm to vulnerable people. The discussion continued for another hour, moving through security protocols and investigation procedures, while the deeper questions remained largely unaddressed. Hayes was competent at managing threats he could identify and quantify, but Elizabeth's situation involved moral complexities that fell outside traditional security frameworks. Finally, as midnight approached and exhaustion began to affect everyone's judgment, Robert made a decision that surprised even himself. "Walter, I want you to investigate the security breach, but I also want you to compile information about every person and organization that's been negatively affected by recent Foundation decisions. If someone is angry enough to threaten my daughter, I want to understand why." Hayes nodded, though Maria could see his reluctance to expand the investigation beyond conventional parameters. Security professionals were trained to focus on method and opportunity rather than motive, but Elizabeth's case required understanding the difference between criminal intent and passionate advocacy. As the meeting broke up and security personnel returned to their posts, Maria found herself alone with Robert and Elizabeth in the library that had been the site of so many family arguments. The room felt different now, less like a battlefield and more like a place where difficult conversations could happen without permanent damage to relationships. "I'm proud of you," Robert said to Elizabeth, his voice carrying emotions he rarely allowed himself to express. "For going to the shelter, for standing up for your beliefs, for challenging me to be better than I thought I needed to be." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but they were different from the angry tears that had marked their previous confrontations. These were tears of relief, of finally feeling heard and understood by the person whose opinion mattered most. "I was so scared," she admitted, "not just of the threats, but of disappointing you, of becoming someone you couldn't be proud of." "You could never disappoint me by caring too much about other people," Robert replied. "I may not always understand your methods, but I have never questioned your heart." Maria felt like an intruder on this moment of family reconciliation, but neither father nor daughter seemed to notice her presence. They were focused entirely on each other, working to bridge the gap that had been created by competing visions of how to use power responsibly. "The Foundation partnership Sister Margaret discussed," Elizabeth said, wiping her eyes with determination. "I want to make it happen, not just as a pilot program or a public relations gesture, but as a fundamental change in how we approach charitable giving." Robert nodded, though Maria could see him calculating practical implications even as he agreed to philosophical changes. "It won't be simple," he warned. "The board has legal and fiduciary responsibilities that limit how quickly we can change direction, and there will be political consequences. Some of our traditional donor relationships might be affected if we start funding more controversial programs." "I know," Elizabeth replied, "but isn't that exactly the point? If we're only comfortable funding programs that don't challenge anyone's assumptions, then we're not really addressing problems. We're just making ourselves feel better about their existence." The conversation shifted to practical planning, with father and daughter working together to outline a proposal that would satisfy both Elizabeth's passion for direct service and Robert's need for institutional accountability. Maria listened to their collaboration with growing hope, recognizing that the crisis had created an opportunity for the Sullivan family to redefine their legacy in more humane terms. But even as they planned for a better future, the immediate threats remained unresolved. Somewhere in Chicago, people were angry enough about the family's past decisions to risk criminal charges by making threats against Elizabeth, and somewhere within Robert's trusted circle, someone was sharing information that enabled those threats. "Maria," Robert said suddenly, turning to acknowledge her presence for the first time in over an hour. "I owe you an apology and an enormous debt of gratitude. Without your insight about Elizabeth's motivations, we might never have found her. More importantly, you helped me understand what she was trying to tell me about the Foundation's impact." Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct praise from her employer. "I just listened," she said quietly. "Sometimes that's all people need, someone to listen without trying to fix immediately." "That's a skill I need to develop," Robert admitted. "I've spent so many years solving problems that I forgot how to sit with them long enough to understand what they're really about." As dawn approached over Chicago, the three of them sat in comfortable quiet, each processing the events of a night that had transformed family relationships and revealed new possibilities for using wealth in service of justice. Elizabeth had returned home, but she had also brought with her the lessons she had learned about dignity, service, and the difference between charity and justice. The security investigation would continue, and eventually they would identify the source of the information leaks and the people making threats. But Maria sensed that those discoveries would matter less than the changes the crisis had already catalyzed in how the Sullivan family understood their responsibilities to each other and to the broader community. "Get some rest," Robert said finally, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Tomorrow we have work to do, real work, the kind that changes lives instead of just managing them." As Maria prepared to leave the mansion for her small apartment in Pilsen, she reflected on the unexpected ways that crisis could become catalyst for growth. Elizabeth's courage in confronting injustice had challenged her father to expand his definition of successful philanthropy. Her flight to the shelter had forced family conversations that might otherwise have been avoided for years. Her willingness to work alongside people whose lives had been affected by their family's decisions had created understanding that no amount of boardroom discussion could have achieved. The morning light was beginning to filter through Chicago's skyline as Maria stepped outside, and the city looked different somehow. More connected, more human, more full of possibility. Somewhere in its depths, the women of Casa de Esperanza were beginning another day of rebuilding their lives with courage and mutual support. Somewhere else, the Sullivan family was beginning to discover what it might mean to use their privilege in service of genuine transformation. And Maria, who had started this journey as an invisible employee, keeping rich people's secrets, was discovering that sometimes the most important work happened in the spaces between worlds, in the moments when different experiences met and created new understanding of what it meant to care for each other across lines of class, culture, and expectation. 3 months later, the transformation was visible in ways both large and small. The Sullivan Foundation had formally partnered with Casa de Esperanza and 5 other community-based organizations, funding not just direct services, but advocacy work and policy research that addressed root causes of the problems they encountered. Elizabeth split her time between foundation work and hands-on volunteering. bringing to board meetings the voices and stories of people whose lives were affected by funding decisions. But the changes went deeper than organizational restructuring. The mansion itself felt different, warmer, more alive, filled with the kind of energy that came from purposeful work rather than isolated wealth. Elizabeth's friends now included women she had met at the shelter, and the dinner conversations Maria overheard were about immigration policy and domestic violence resources as often as they were about stock portfolios and real estate investments. The security investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about the sources of the threats against Elizabeth. The information leaks had come not from criminal conspiracy, but from a foundation board member whose own daughter had been denied services at a shelter that lost funding due to budget cuts. The man had shared confidential information not to enable terrorism, but to force accountability, though he had gravely underestimated how that information would be used by people whose anger had curdled into dangerous resentment. The revelation had forced difficult conversations about the collateral damage of charitable decisions and the ways that abstract policy discussions affected real families facing crises. But it had also opened possibilities for addressing grievances through dialogue rather than threats, creating channels for community input that had previously been absent from foundation governance. Maria's role in the household had evolved as well, though the changes were subtle and sometimes hard to define. She was still the maid, still responsible for maintaining the mansion's pristine appearance and managing household logistics. But she was also seen and valued in ways that went beyond her job description. Her insights about community needs informed foundation discussions, and her connections to Chicago's Latino community had proven invaluable in understanding how policy changes affected families like her own. More importantly, Robert and Elizabeth had both learned to see her as a person whose judgment mattered, whose experience offered perspectives they couldn't access through wealth or education alone. The invisible employee had become visible not through dramatic gestures, but through consistent demonstration of wisdom, compassion, and strength. One evening in late spring, as Chicago was beginning to shake off winter's grip, and the mansion's garden showed signs of renewed life, Maria found herself having dinner with the Sullivan family instead of serving it. The invitation had surprised her, but Elizabeth had insisted, and Robert had agreed with the kind of warmth that had become characteristic of their transformed relationship. The shelter served 43 families last month, Elizabeth reported, consulting notes she had made during her morning volunteer shift. 3 women found permanent housing, 2 completed their GED programs, and 1 started her own house cleaning business with a microfinance loan from the Community Development Fund. Robert listened with the attention he had once reserved for quarterly earnings reports, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest in outcomes that couldn't be measured in dollars. The businessman's mindset was still there, but it had expanded to include metrics of human flourishing alongside traditional measures of organizational success. "And the policy advocacy work?" he asked. "Sister Margaret testified before the City Council about the housing crisis, using data we've been collecting about the correlation between domestic violence and homelessness," Elizabeth replied. "Congressman Garcia has agreed to include funding for legal services in the upcoming immigration reform bill, partly based on documentation of need that our partnership networks have provided." Maria listened to this conversation with the kind of quiet pride that came from seeing small actions create large changes. The partnership that had been born from crisis was producing results that went far beyond what any single organization could have achieved independently. But the most significant change wasn't in community impact metrics or policy advocacy victories. It was in the way the Sullivan family had learned to see themselves as part of a broader human community rather than separate from it. Their wealth was still vast, their privilege still real, but both were now understood as tools for service rather than sources of separation. "Maria," Robert said, turning to include her in the conversation, "Rosa mentioned that your son Diego is interested in studying business. Has he thought about college applications?" The question was casual, but Maria understood its implications. Robert was offering to help her son access opportunities that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Not as charity, but as recognition that investment in individual potential created value that extended far beyond traditional educational or economic measurements. He wants to study social entrepreneurship, Maria replied, her voice warm with maternal pride. He's been inspired by seeing how business principles can be applied to community problems through the Foundation's work. The irony was beautiful, Maria reflected. Diego wanted to study business because he had seen how it could serve human needs rather than exploit them. Elizabeth had shown him that wealth could be a tool for justice, and that success could be measured by lives improved rather than just profits generated. As they finished dinner and moved to the library for coffee, Maria thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Elizabeth's courage in confronting injustice, Robert's willingness to expand his definitions of success, and her own decision to speak truth even when it risked her employment. All had been necessary ingredients in the transformation that was still unfolding. "There's something I want to discuss with both of you," Robert said, settling into his favorite chair with a deliberate manner that preceded important announcements. "I've been thinking about succession planning for the Foundation, about how to ensure that the changes we've made survive beyond my own involvement." Elizabeth and Maria exchanged glances, recognizing the weight of whatever Robert was about to propose. "I want to establish a community advisory board with real power to influence funding decisions," he continued. "Not just a rubber stamp for predetermined priorities, but genuine community leadership that can guide our work based on direct experience with the problems we're trying to address." The proposal was radical in its implications. A wealthy foundation voluntarily surrendering decision-making authority to people whose primary qualification was experience rather than credentials or connections. It represented everything Elizabeth had been arguing for, taken to its logical conclusion. "Who would serve on this board?" she asked, her voice careful with hope. "People like Sister Margaret, like community organizers and social workers who see the daily impact of policy decisions," Robert replied. "People like Rosa, who understand both the potential and the limitations of charitable assistance. People who can help us understand not just what needs to be done, but how to do it in ways that respect the dignity and agency of the people we're trying to help." Mew. Maria felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the full scope of what Robert was proposing. He was creating a structure that would ensure the Foundation's work remained grounded in community wisdom rather than abstract good intentions. He was institutionalizing the lessons his daughter had taught him about the difference between charity and justice. "And Maria," Robert continued, turning to look at her directly, "I want you to consider joining the Foundation staff as our community liaison. Your insights have been invaluable in helping us understand how our decisions affect families like your own, and your connections to Chicago's Latino community would strengthen our ability to serve effectively." The offer was unexpected and overwhelming, representing not just professional advancement, but recognition that her experience and judgment were valuable assets rather than invisible necessities. She would move from serving wealth to helping shape how it was used, from being an employee to being a partner in the work of justice. "I don't have education in nonprofit management," Maria said carefully. "I don't know about grant writing or program evaluation or budget analysis." "You know about dignity," Elizabeth replied. "You know about what it feels like to be invisible and what it means to be seen. You know the difference between help that empowers and help that humiliates. Those are the most important qualifications for this work." As the evening progressed and plans began to take shape, Maria reflected on the unexpected ways that life could change when people chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, connection over isolation. Elizabeth's willingness to confront injustice had created space for everyone around her to grow into better versions of themselves. The threats against the family had been resolved not through increased security, but through increased accountability. The Foundation's critics had become its partners, helping shape its work in ways that addressed their concerns while expanding its impact. The girl who had run away from privilege had learned to use it responsibly, and the father who had built an empire on calculation had learned to value outcomes that couldn't be quantified. And Maria, who had begun as an invisible maid cleaning up other people's messes, had become a bridge between worlds, helping translate the needs of her community into language that wealth and power could understand and act upon. 6 months later, as Chicago dressed itself in autumn colors that rivaled the most expensive artwork in the Sullivan Mansion, Maria sat in her new office at the Sullivan Foundation, reviewing applications from community organizations seeking funding for innovative programs. Her desk was covered with proposals that reflected the same creative problem-solving she had watched her neighbors employ for years, people finding ways to meet urgent needs with limited resources and unlimited determination. The move from domestic service to nonprofit work had required adjustments that went far beyond learning new job duties. She had enrolled in evening classes on grant management and program evaluation, discovering that her instincts about effective assistance aligned well with formal best practices in community development. More challenging had been learning to see herself as someone whose opinions mattered, whose decisions affected not just her own family, but entire communities. But the most significant change had been in her relationship with the Sullivan family. She was no longer their employee in any traditional sense, but rather a colleague and friend whose presence in their lives had been chosen rather than contracted. Sunday dinners at the mansion had become regular occurrences, with Isabella and Diego joining conversations about everything from homework struggles to immigration policy. Elizabeth had thrived in her expanded role at the foundation, bringing to the work a combination of idealism and pragmatism that impressed even veteran nonprofit administrators. She had learned to channel her passion for justice through strategic thinking and collaborative leadership, building coalitions that amplified the impact of every dollar the foundation invested. But perhaps most remarkably, she had maintained her connections to Casa de Esperanza and the other community organizations that had taught her about the daily reality of poverty and resilience. One evening each week, she still volunteered in the shelter kitchen, chopping vegetables and listening to stories that kept her grounded in the human consequences of policy decisions. Robert had discovered that surrendering control could actually increase impact, as community oversight of the Foundation's work ensured that funding decisions reflected genuine need rather than donor preferences. The advisory board Maria had helped establish brought perspectives to their deliberations that no amount of research or analysis could have provided, making their investments more effective and more respectful of the communities they served. The businessman's mindset that had built his empire now served a different purpose, applied to maximizing social return on investment rather than just financial return. He had learned to measure success in terms of systems changed, lives improved, and communities strengthened, metrics that were harder to quantify but more meaningful than quarterly profit statements. As Maria reviewed a particularly innovative proposal from a group of formerly incarcerated women who wanted to start a catering business that would provide both employment and life skills training, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The proposal embodied everything she had learned about effective assistance. It was designed by the people it would serve. It addressed multiple needs simultaneously, and it created opportunities for dignity rather than just survival. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation, and Elizabeth's voice carried the excitement that had become characteristic of her approach to foundation work. "Maria, you need to see this," Elizabeth said, her words tumbling over each other with enthusiasm. "The Housing First initiative we funded in Pilsen, they've been tracking outcomes, and the results are incredible. Not just housing stability, but employment rates, children's school performance, even community solidarity measures." Maria smiled, recognizing in Elizabeth's excitement the same passion that had driven the girl to challenge her father's approach to philanthropy months earlier. But now that passion was informed by data, supported by community partnerships, and channeled through sustainable institutional structures. "Send me the report," Maria replied. "And let's schedule a meeting with the housing advocates to discuss expanding the program to other neighborhoods." As she hung up the phone, Maria thought about the ways that individual courage could catalyze broader transformations. Elizabeth's willingness to confront injustice had changed not just her family's foundation, but her own understanding of what it meant to use privilege responsibly. Her flight to the shelter had forced conversations that created space for everyone involved to grow into better versions of themselves. But the story wasn't finished. Would never be finished, really, because the work of justice was ongoing, requiring constant attention and regular renewal. Each day brought new applications from community organizations with innovative approaches to persistent problems. Each week brought reports of successes and setbacks that informed future funding decisions. Each month brought opportunities to learn from mistakes and expand understanding of effective assistance. The Sullivan Foundation had become something different from what it had been, not just a tool for tax advantage giving, but a bridge between privilege and need, between good intentions and effective action, between charity and justice. And Maria, who had begun as an invisible employee, cleaning up other people's messes, had become a translator between worlds, helping ensure that wealth served wisdom and that power remained accountable to the people it claimed to help. As evening fell over Chicago and Maria prepared to leave her office for the short bus ride back to Pilsen, she carried with her the satisfaction of work that mattered in ways that transcended individual advancement or institutional success. She was helping create a world where dignity wasn't dependent on wealth, where assistance strengthened rather than diminished the people it reached, where justice was measured not by good intentions, but by concrete improvements in people's daily lives. The city stretched out before her, full of both problems and possibilities, and Maria walked into it with the confidence of someone who had learned that individual courage, multiplied by collective action and sustained by institutional commitment, could indeed create change that lasted beyond any single person's efforts. The Sullivan Mansion still stood on Lakeshore Drive, still housed wealth beyond most people's imagining, but it was no longer a fortress separating privilege from need. It had become a place where different worlds met and created new understanding, where wealth learned to serve wisdom, where power learned to listen to truth. And in a small apartment in Pilsen, where radiators still knocked with mechanical protest and children still did homework at kitchen tables, the same lessons were being learned by a new generation, that dignity belonged to everyone, that justice required everyone's participation, and that love, when it was real, always demanded growth from those brave enough to accept its challenges. Today, if you drive past that mansion on Chicago's North Side, you might notice that it looks less like a monument to wealth and more like a home where people have learned to care for each other across all the lines that usually divide us. And if you listen carefully, you might hear something that wasn't there before, the sound of lives being lived not in isolation from need, but in service to it, not in competition with others, but in collaboration for everyone's flourishing. The story began with a silent woman whose quiet strength shook the walls of a billionaire's fortress. But it ends with the understanding that real strength comes not from building walls, but from building bridges, not from accumulating wealth, but from sharing wisdom, not from protecting privilege, but from using it to expand justice for everyone. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it out loud? Have you found yourself invisible to people who needed to see you most clearly? Have you discovered that sometimes the most important changes begin with simple acts of courage performed by people the world considers powerless? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one touched your soul, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to remember that her strength, her wisdom, and her dignity matter more than any amount of money ever could. For more stories that honor the invisible work that holds our world together, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey with us. See you in the next story.